When my friend Sarah and I got to the Amazon, it was like stepping into a completely different world. I'm 69, and I've seen a lot in my life, but nothing like that forest. The trees were so thick you could barely see the sky, and the heat felt like it was wrapping around you. Every sound seemed to be coming from something hidden, like the whole forest was watching us. Sarah had set up our stay in a small cabin a day's hike into the jungle. She's always been the adventurous one. A guide she knew well had found the cabin for us, saying it was safe and had all the basic stuff we'd need. It was on stilts, raised a bit above the forest floor, surrounded by trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. We reached it late in the afternoon, just as it was getting dark. The cabin was simple, one room with a small bed, a table, and 2 chairs. It wasn't much, but it was solid, and that gave me some comfort. That first night was quiet. The forest sounds were strange, but after a while, they almost felt calming, like a strange song in the background. But on the second day, something started to feel wrong. Little things caught my eye. Sticks arranged oddly near the cabin. A shoe print in the mud that didn't belong to either of us. I tried to tell myself it could have been from a guide or someone else passing through, but it felt off, like it wasn't there by chance. On the third night, I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound I'd never heard before. A soft rustling, just outside the cabin walls. It was so faint at first, I thought maybe I was imagining it, but it got louder, like someone was walking slowly, testing the ground with each step. My heart started pounding, each beat so strong I felt it in my chest. I lay there, hardly breathing, listening as the sounds moved around the cabin. And then, just as quickly as it started, the sound stopped. The forest went dead silent, except for a few distant calls of animals. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to even look toward the window. The next morning, I went outside and found footprints circling the cabin, pressed deep into the damp ground. They were large, like an adult's, but the worst part was that they led right up to the window, as if someone had been watching us from the outside. I tried to tell myself we were safe in the cabin, that maybe it was just a curious passerby. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. I didn't tell Sarah about the footprints. I didn't want to scare her, and there wasn't anything we could do anyway. We were a day's hike from the nearest village, no phone, no way to call for help. All we could do was sit tight and hope nothing worse happened. That night, the sounds came back, louder this time. Something was tapping on the walls, like fingers drumming. I felt Sarah tense up next to me as we both lay there, perfectly still, listening. Every muscle in my body was tight, like a wound-up spring, ready to snap. In the morning, we found long, thin scratches along the wooden walls of the cabin. They weren't like anything an animal would make. They looked intentional, like someone had dragged a knife down the wood, leaving marks that ran deep. My stomach dropped when I saw them. Whatever had been outside wasn't just curious. It was testing us, maybe even trying to scare us. We spent the day sticking close, keeping watch, trying to ignore the creeping fear building up inside us. But I knew we couldn't stay there another night. We decided we'd leave in the morning, pack what little we had, and make our way back to the village as quickly as possible. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay there, listening to every sound, every shift in the forest. And then, just after midnight, it happened again. I heard footsteps on the porch. They were slow and heavy, each step deliberate. My heart raced, and I lay there frozen, too afraid to move or even breathe. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I could feel the weight of whatever was on the other side, like it was pressing down through the floorboards. A soft scraping sound came next, like nails or something sharp dragging along the wood. It felt like time had stopped, with this heavy silence pressing down on us, trapping us in that cabin. Then, just as suddenly, the sounds faded away. The steps moved off the porch and disappeared into the forest until all I could hear was the faint hum of the jungle. When the first bit of daylight came, we didn't waste a second. We grabbed our bags and left that cabin behind. The hike back to the village felt like a blur, with every rustle in the forest making me jump. Even though we made it back safely, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Now, even at home, I still see those footprints in my mind, circling the cabin. I still feel that weight outside the door, pressing down, waiting. And sometimes, when the night is dead silent, I could swear I hear it again. Those slow, careful footsteps, coming closer, step by step. It's like whatever was out there is still waiting, somewhere just out of sight, but getting closer every night. Jack and I had planned a quiet weekend at this old cabin out in the English countryside. It was a small, broken-down place, just one room with a creaky bed and a few wobbly wooden chairs. But we'd heard there were some interesting spots nearby, including an ancient graveyard not too far off. Jack loved history, and I guess that curiosity rubbed off on me, too. We thought it would be cool to check it out, wander around a bit, and maybe take some photos. The cabin sat away from the main road, surrounded by thick trees on all sides, but the graveyard was only about a 15-minute walk along a narrow path. We got there just as the sky started to darken, stretching long shadows over the old headstones. The place felt forgotten, like no one had set foot there in ages. Stone markers leaned in weird angles, and most of the names and dates had worn away, covered in moss and weeds. Jack drifted off to check out some of the older graves, but I stayed near the entrance. Something about the quiet felt strange, like the whole place was holding its breath. The air seemed colder, too, even though it hadn't felt chilly when we left the cabin. I kept telling myself I was just being jumpy, letting my imagination get the best of me, but the feeling that we didn't belong there wouldn't go away. As time passed, the light faded faster than I'd thought it would. The trees around the graveyard were thick, blocking most of the evening sun, and the shadows grew heavier, taking over the whole place. Jack was still wandering around, lost in his own world, so I decided to walk over and grab his attention. But just as I took a step, I spotted something out of the corner of my eye. There was a small, dark hole in the ground, partly hidden by some brush near a bigger headstone. It looked like an old grave that had collapsed, leaving a narrow opening down into the dirt. For some reason, I couldn't look away. Even though it didn't feel like a smart move, I stepped closer and leaned in a bit to get a better look. The hole was small, maybe just big enough for a person to squeeze through, but it looked deep, stretching down into pure darkness. I felt a strange pull, like something down there wanted me to keep looking. I leaned in a little more, trying to see if I could make out anything in the shadows. And then I heard it, a faint sound coming from somewhere deep inside the hole. A soft, shuffling noise, like something moving far below, echoing up from a place that shouldn't have been disturbed. I stumbled back, heart pounding. I looked over at Jack, but he was busy with his camera, not noticing a thing. I wanted to call him over, to tell him what I'd heard, but I couldn't seem to make a sound. Instead, I kept backing away from the hole, my eyes glued to it, half expecting something to crawl out of the darkness. Suddenly, the air felt thick and heavy, like it was pressing down on me. The graveyard, the cabin, this whole weekend, it all felt wrong. There was a smell now too, faint but unmistakable, like wet earth mixed with something sour and old. I looked over at Jack, gave him a signal that we needed to leave, and thankfully, he noticed and started walking toward me. We left the graveyard fast, not saying a word, just moving. By the time we got back to the cabin, the sky was almost black, and it felt like the silence from the graveyard had followed us back. We locked the door, even though we knew there wasn't a soul around for miles, and sat there in the quiet, both of us trying to shake the feeling that something was watching us. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old cabin sounded like footsteps, and every gust of wind through the trees reminded me of that shuffling sound from the hole. I lay there, wide awake, feeling trapped, as if the shadows from the graveyard had somehow crawled inside, hiding in the corners of the room. In the morning, we packed up and left without a single word. As we drove away, I looked back just once, expecting to see the cabin in the morning light. But all I saw was the path leading back to that graveyard, with its crooked stones and dark corners pulling at me, like a part of me hadn't left. And that pull hasn't gone away since. Even now, back home, I can still feel that weight pressing down on me sometimes, like something is waiting. And when the house gets too quiet, I hear it, the faintest shuffle of something moving far below, almost like it's getting closer, waiting for me to come back, or worse, waiting for the right moment to come to me. I rented a small cabin up in the mountains for a weekend, hoping to just get away from it all. The place was pretty isolated, surrounded by tall trees and thick bushes, with a single dirt road leading in and out. I figured it'd be peaceful, just what I needed to clear my head. The cabin next door looked old and run down, like nobody had lived there for years. But I saw an old, beat-up car in the driveway that evening, so I figured someone must live there. The next morning, while I was sipping my coffee on the porch, I noticed my neighbors. The man was rough-looking, probably middle-aged, with a long beard and dirty clothes. His wife, looking just as worn down, stood quietly behind him. They were just staring at me from their porch with empty expressions. I felt a bit uncomfortable and gave a small nod to be polite, but they didn't react. They just stood there watching me like they were sizing me up. Throughout the day, I kept catching glimpses of them. Sometimes I'd look up from reading or while I was walking around outside, and there they were watching from a distance. Sometimes they stood at the edge of their property or behind the trees, just staring, faces blank. I told myself it was nothing, that they were just an odd couple who maybe weren't used to seeing people around. Still, something felt off. There was this strange way about them. They moved slow, like they had nothing else to do but stand there and keep an eye on me. By evening, that feeling of being watched had really sunk in. I shut all the blinds, locked the doors, and tried to settle down. I was hoping to relax and finally shake the weirdness of the day. But around midnight, I heard footsteps outside, soft but clear. My heart pounded as I crept to the window. They were both there, standing right outside, looking in through the glass. Their faces were blank, but their eyes were fixed on me. It was like they were waiting for something, like they expected me to do something. I didn't move, and they just kept staring. They stood there for hours, completely still, as if frozen in place. I tried to stay quiet, barely breathing, hoping they'd eventually go away. But I felt trapped, knowing they were right there. Sleep was out of the question. I was too scared to even close my eyes. Finally, as the sky started to lighten, they slowly turned around and went back to their cabin, disappearing into the shadows like nothing had happened. The next morning, I didn't waste any time packing up. I was exhausted, and my nerves were shot. I just wanted to get out of there. As I drove down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there they were, standing in the middle of the road, watching me drive away until I was out of sight. Back home, curiosity got the better of me, and I looked up the property online. I found an old listing for the cabin, but the details made my stomach drop. It said the place next door had been abandoned for over a decade, after the last couple living there had died in an accident on the very road I'd just driven out on. The description went on to say that nobody had been able to live in the cabin for long. People had complained about strange noises, about being watched, about seeing figures that just shouldn't be there. And the part that really got to me? a warning saying that the last people to stay there had been followed home. We had planned for this to be a simple, relaxing weekend. My business partner Mike, his wife Sarah, my dog Jackson, and I had rented a small cabin up in the mountains. It was far from everything, just the way we wanted it. A break from everything, just the four of us and nature. We arrived late on Friday, just as the sun was setting. The cabin was small, one story, but perfect for the four of us. We unloaded the car, set up a fire in the main room, and cooked a simple meal. It was peaceful, too peaceful almost. The only sounds we could hear were the occasional howl of a coyote in the distance and the rustling of the trees. The first night was calm, but I couldn't sleep. Something didn't feel right. It was like the cabin was holding its breath. The next day, we went for a short hike nearby. Jackson stayed close to me, sniffing around, his ears twitching at every sound. We didn't see anyone else, not even another hiker. The whole area felt empty. That night, something felt different. We went to bed early, all of us tired from the hike. In the middle of the night, Jackson started barking. Not his usual bark, but a deep, angry bark, like he was warning us. His barking didn't stop. I woke up with my heart racing, and there he was at the door, staring at it, his body tense and tail stiff. I listened, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing. It was too quiet outside. The woods, which should have been filled with the usual nighttime noises, were silent. Mike and Sarah woke up too, and we all just lay there in the dark, unsure what to do. I figured it was probably just an animal, maybe a bear. We tried to calm Jackson, but he wouldn't stop. He kept barking, growling low, then barking again, never taking his eyes off the door. Then we heard it, footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps, moving back and forth outside the cabin. My blood went cold. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't speak, just walked around the cabin in the dark. Jackson's growling grew louder, and he pressed his nose against the bottom of the door, his fur standing up. I felt the air around us get heavier, like it was pressing down. It felt like hours, but it was only a few minutes before the footsteps stopped. We sat there in complete silence, not daring to move or make a sound. Then the footsteps started again. This time they were moving to the back of the cabin. My chest tightened. The walls seemed to close in on us. Every small sound was loud in the quiet. The creak of the floorboards, the rustling of clothes, even the sound of our breathing seemed too loud. We stayed like that for the rest of the night, barely breathing, listening for any sound, any sign that whoever or whatever was out there had left. When the sun finally came up, we couldn't get out of the cabin fast enough. The air outside was cold, and the ground was covered with deep footprints, heavy boot prints that circled the cabin. They weren't ours. Whoever it was had been walking around the cabin all night, watching us. We didn't wait to find out more. We packed up quickly, not even bothering to check the rest of the cabin. We were too freaked out to stick around. The drive back to town was quiet. None of us spoke. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there, that we'd been watched the whole time. Something had been out there in the dark, just waiting. Even now, I can't forget the feeling of those heavy footsteps, the silence, the way Jackson had acted. I've never been back to that cabin, and neither has Mike or Sarah. None of us ever talked about it much after we left, but every now and then, when I'm alone in the woods, I wonder if it's still out there. That thing, watching, waiting for someone else to come by. I hope it never finds me again. But deep down, I know it's still out there, somewhere, just waiting for the next group to wander too far into its reach. The rain hammered down on my truck, making it harder to see as I followed the winding road through the forest. Darkness covered everything around me, and the trees looked like huge, silent figures towering over the road. My hands gripped the steering wheel tight, and my mind kept circling back to the man waiting for this delivery. Retired or not, he was known as someone you didn't mess with. Rumor was he left the police force under strange circumstances, something about a case that got too personal for him. I'd never met him before, but I'd heard he lived alone in a cabin way out in the forest, cut off from everyone. Apparently, he liked it that way. I just had to deliver this package and get out. It should have been simple enough, but the dark, the rain, and the thought of meeting him out here had me on edge. The directions were clear. When I finally spotted the cabin, it was barely visible through the heavy rain, a dark shape against the trees. I parked, grabbed the package, and stepped out into the cold rain, which soaked through my jacket right away, making me shiver. The cabin looked old, worn down, with patches of moss growing along the wooden walls. It looked quiet, almost too quiet, with no lights on inside. As I got closer, I noticed something odd: 2 sets of footprints leading up to the door. One set was big, likely his, but the other was smaller, like someone else had shown up before me. No other cars had passed me on the road, so this made no sense. I knocked, but there was no answer. The door was cracked open, barely held in place as the wind blew it back and forth. I pushed it open, hoping he was just asleep or maybe out back. Inside, the cabin was dark, the only light flashing in through the windows whenever lightning struck. The air inside felt stale, with a faint metallic smell that reminded me of old blood. I tried calling out, but there was nothing, just silence. My flashlight caught something on the floor near the door, a gun lying there, like it had been dropped without a second thought. My stomach tightened. Something was very wrong. Part of me wanted to leave, but I took a step inside anyway, following the muddy footprints tracked across the floor. As I walked in, I looked around the small room. The bed was messy, the blankets pushed aside. A faint shine on a nearby table caught my eye. His old police badge, a reminder of who he used to be. Then I noticed a dark stain on the floor near the bed, fresh and spreading. My heart raced as I stared at it. The stain led to the far corner of the room, where something lay under a tarp. I could make out the shape of a boot sticking out, too big to be anyone else's but his. I realized with a sick feeling that he hadn't just left. He was here, dead, and had been for a while. Then I heard a faint creak behind me, close to the open door. I spun around, but no one was there. It was just the rain, the dark forest outside. But as I backed away from the door, a chill ran down my neck. Someone else had been here recently, maybe still was, and those smaller footprints proved it. I dropped the package on the floor and moved quickly toward the door, instincts telling me to leave now. As I reached my truck, I froze. Through the rain, a dark figure stepped out from the trees just beyond the cabin. They stopped and stared at me. I couldn't make out their face, but I could feel their eyes locked on me, cold and unblinking. I didn't hesitate. I jumped into my truck, locked the doors, and floored the gas, my tires slipping in the mud as I sped down the road. In the rearview mirror, I watched the cabin disappear into the dark, the shadowy figure still standing there, watching as I drove away. I didn't stop for miles, my heart pounding, breathing fast. The memory of that figure burned into my mind. Those footprints had been theirs. They had followed me, led me to find what they'd done. Maybe they were waiting for me to discover it. As I drove farther, the full horror sank in. I hadn't just been delivering a package. I'd been a loose end, and I'd only just managed to escape. But I knew this wasn't over. Somewhere out there, hidden in the dark, they were still out there, still watching, waiting. And if they had followed me this far, maybe they weren't done with me. Next time, I might not get away so easily. I'll never forget the trip to the cabin with my dog and grandfather. He hadn't seen his ex-wife, my grandmother, in years, but after some convincing, they decided to meet up at the cabin for a quiet weekend. I didn't know what to expect, but from the moment we arrived, something felt off. We got there late in the afternoon, just as the sun was setting behind the tall trees. The cabin was alone, sitting at the edge of a small, quiet lake and surrounded by thick woods. My dog, Max, started barking and growling toward the woods as soon as we got out of the car, but I didn't think much of it. Max was always a little jumpy. Grandpa, on the other hand, didn't seem worried at all. He just stood there, looking around like he had been here 100 times before. That first night was quiet, though. We ate dinner together, and after that, I took Max for a short walk. The air was cool, and the woods were silent, which felt strange. Max kept tugging at the leash, looking back at me with wide eyes like he was scared. I thought maybe he was just uneasy because of the new place, but even after we went back inside, he wouldn't calm down. He kept pacing around the cabin, whining and acting strange. Eventually, I gave in and let him sleep in my room so he wouldn't bother Grandpa. The next day, we went for a walk by the lake. Grandpa said a little about the old days, how he and my grandmother used to come here. He didn't say much, but I could tell there were things he didn't want to talk about. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the trees, things started to feel weird. Max started barking again, but this time it was more urgent, more frantic. He was running around in circles, pulling on his leash like he wanted to run into the woods. I tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't listen. Grandpa looked at me and then at the woods. For a moment he was quiet, and then he said something I couldn't quite understand. She hated this place. I didn't know what he meant, but then he pointed to a small, overgrown path that led deep into the trees. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I noticed Max was pulling harder than ever, barking and growling at the dark woods, like something was out there. That night, things got worse. We were sitting in the living room, and I heard a noise outside. It wasn't anything I could explain. At first, it sounded like someone walking around the cabin, but when I looked outside, I didn't see anything. Max stopped barking and stood completely still, his ears flat against his head, trembling. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Grandpa didn't seem to notice. He was sitting there, reading his book like everything was normal. But then I heard it again, a dragging sound, like something heavy was being dragged across the ground, moving slowly toward us. I grabbed Max and went to the back window, peering out into the dark. The trees were still, the air was thick with silence, but I could feel something wrong out there, watching us. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away from the window slowly, holding Max tight against me. The sound stopped, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We hurriedly packed up, and I noticed that Max had finally calmed down, but it was the kind of calm that made me nervous. He was too quiet, almost like he knew something was about to happen. Grandpa seemed off too. He was moving slower, like he didn't want to leave the cabin, but at the same time, he looked like he couldn't get away fast enough. As we were about to leave, Grandpa paused at the edge of the woods. His face was pale, his hand trembling slightly as he looked out at the trees. "We shouldn't have come here," he muttered under his breath. We didn't talk much after that. We left in a hurry, driving back to the city in silence. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, but there was nothing, just the road behind us. But as we passed the woods, I looked one last time, and my stomach dropped. At the edge of the trees, just beyond where I could clearly see, a shadow moved. Tall, thin, standing still like it was watching us leave. I don't know what that thing was, but it wasn't natural. I can still see it in my mind. I didn't ask Grandpa what he meant when he said, "She hated this place." But now I think I understand. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just the woods. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something else. Something that waited, hidden in those trees, just out of sight, waiting for us to leave, and maybe waiting for us to come back. I've always liked the peace and quiet of being in the woods, so when I found an old, small cabin near the border of the United States, I decided to stay for a few days. The cabin was tucked away deep in the trees, far from any neighbors, a perfect place to get away from everything. Inside, the cabin had an old wood stove and a simple bed. A river ran close by, and everything felt calm and peaceful, a perfect escape from the busy world. But after a few days, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could really explain at first, just a strange feeling that wouldn't go away. The first real sign something wasn't right came on the second night. I had just gotten into bed when I heard something heavy moving through the bushes outside. It wasn't an animal or the wind. It sounded like something big, something that knew what it was doing. I stayed still, holding my breath as my heart raced. The noise stopped suddenly, and I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The next morning, I decided to walk around, hoping to clear my head. I thought staying busy would help get rid of the weird feeling. I walked along the river, the sound of the rushing water in the air, but something still didn't feel right. The trees were thick and the place was too quiet. No birds, no animals running around. It was just the wind and the water. As I made my way back to the cabin, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. There was a trail of broken branches leading into the woods. It wasn't from an animal. It was too neat, too careful. Someone had been here recently. I froze, my stomach turning. The cabin was far from anything else. No one else should have been here. I rushed back to the cabin and locked the door behind me. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger as the day went on. That night, I sat by the fire, trying to stay calm, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. The wind picked up outside, but this time it sounded different, like something was brushing against the cabin. The noise sent a cold shiver through me. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't just the wind. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, staring into the fire, listening to every noise outside. Every crack, every rustle made my heart race. I was waiting for something, anything. The feeling of being watched was so strong, I could almost feel someone right outside the door. When morning finally came, I hurried to pack my things, ready to leave. As I bent down to grab my bag, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, carved into the doorframe, was a strange symbol. It was crude, scratched into the wood with something sharp. I didn't know what it meant, but it wasn't something I wanted to understand. I could feel someone had been there, and I knew they had been watching me the whole time. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my bags, ran out the door, and didn't stop until I was in my car, speeding away. I didn't look back. As I drove away, my eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror. I had this feeling that something was following me, watching me from the trees. I've never gone back to that cabin, and I never will. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I still hear the rustling of branches outside, the sound of something heavy moving through the woods. And I wonder if the person who carved that symbol is still out there, waiting for the next person to wander into their forest.